So the next section is about a question on a lot of people's minds today. What does it mean to be a good manager in this new context? So joining me now to talk about changing the way we lead post-pandemic are Tera Allas and Bill Schaninger. So Tera is Director of Research and Economics at McKinsey, based in London. Tera leads research in a number of areas, including productivity, innovation, and what drives people's satisfaction and quality of life in and out of the workplace. Bill is a senior partner at McKinsey, where he works with clients on large-scale organizational and cultural change, including around how values and leadership can improve business results. So Tera and Bill, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I know you have a short presentation to set the stage for our further discussion, so you can take it from here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that great introduction. And we're both delighted to be here today to share our research and also to discuss it and find out what kind of questions people have and how we can take it forward. In the kind of short session that we've got in terms of presenting our work, we're going to talk a bit about what we mean by good bosses and why they matter even more now than ever, and also how businesses and individuals can become better at managing and management. We've titled our piece of work Better Bosses, because we think that's kind of a nice short way of summarizing what this is all about. Let me just start with a couple of observations around the research that we've done, and then I'll draw Bill into the conversation as we talk about the implications for large organizations and how they can make this a reality in their organizations. So hopefully you can all see some slides on your screen at the moment. If not, please shout and I will do something about it. But just to start off with an important observation that work is really important for people. Now, as we've had this pandemic, COVID-19 sweep across the planet, people have very much started talking about a mantra of lives and livelihoods. We need to support people's lives and obviously avoid as many deaths as possible, but also support their livelihoods. And when people talk about that, they generally mean, securing jobs, securing income. But what's really interesting when you look at what actually provides life satisfaction to individuals, it's not so much about those kind of livelihood factors. And I've started saying that we need to add a third L to that mantra. It's not just lives and livelihoods, it's also about life satisfaction, the quality of that life. And so if we look at what actually contributes to the quality of life, and this is based on research where people are asked separately on a scale from 0 to 10, how satisfied overall they are with their lives. And then separately, they're asked a million other questions about their lives. And then researchers have analyzed it to understand, well, what contributes to people's life satisfaction in general terms. The sort of livelihoods type stuff is here in the other bucket. In other words, it's less important than the other things that you see on the page. Unsurprisingly, mental health is by far the most important driver of whether people are happy with their lives or not. And physical health is also quite important. Relationships are critical, but what's really surprising to me on this page is that job satisfaction is 25% of anybody's overall life satisfaction. In some other ways, it's not that surprising because people spend an enormous amount of their time at work. And if they're doing well at work, that then mirrors well into the rest of their lives. If they're doing badly at work, or they're unhappy at work, then that will also spill over to their personal life. And as leaders of organizations, I think it's actually our kind of moral responsibility to think about this and consider the fact that every single person who works for us, we are having this enormous impact on not just their working lives, but their overall lives. Of course, we then need to understand, well, what goes into this 25%? What are the drivers of job satisfaction that are so important for people in their overall lives? And when we do that, a big chunk of it has to do with interpersonal relationships at work. Something like 40% of all of people's work satisfaction is actually driven by relationships. A lot less is driven by pay or promotions or terms and conditions and all the kind of various, I would call possibly hygiene factors. Relationships really, really matter. Something like 60% of British people say that they would work even if they didn't need the money. And when you ask them, well, how come? It's a lot to do with these relationships and the social aspects of work and the fact that they have friends and they have colleagues and they have other people to interact with. Out of those social relationships, by far the biggest driver is how you get on with your boss. So hence our title, Better Bosses, because how bosses interact with their team members at work really is critical to that person's satisfaction at work. And while I've taken this kind of story through more of a top-down view of, if we care about people, if we care about, let's say, corporate social responsibility, we need to care about people's job satisfaction. It's clearly also the case that the more satisfied your workers are, the better they are as employees, and the better for the company as a whole. Now, this has been the case for a long time. It's not just a COVID-related thing. So, Bill, do you want to say something about your perspectives over the years and whether being a good boss has, in fact, become even more important recently?
Yeah, thank you. And let's see, are we in the afternoon yet, or are we still in the morning? Yeah, afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, well, you know what? It's growing, and it's a pretty interesting phenomenon. I mean, by background, at one point I thought I was going to be an academic long, long ago when I was finishing my PhD. My dissertation was on things like this, what we call social exchange relationships, and between the boss and and your teammates and whatever. But so at that point, you get to study like 50 years of really good German psychologists explaining why people behave the way they do at work. What's gotten really interesting over, let's say, the last 2.5 decades is the amount of your waking hours spent at work has gone up, and your outside affiliation has tended to go down. I'll speak about largely a North American, particularly an American experience. Participation in organized religion is at an all-time low, at least since they've been recording it. Participation in social organizations, down, right? Significantly. Rate of marriage, down. Right. And I also think there's a rate of parenting also down, but I need to confirm that one. But the point is, all the places where you get your identity and you get your sense of belonging and affiliation, down. Whereas the one place that's still there and probably going up in terms of your waking hours, work. So one, you have this enormous now just ball of your own personal stuff, identity, affiliation, belonging, acceptance, that kind of thing there. So now it matters to you a lot. And singularly, what's the relationship that really determines how that's going is the relationship with you and your boss. And the boss disproportionately determines a lot of things, what you work on, what your priorities are, norms, rules, expectations, a lot of it not written down, a lot of it not really about a rule book, but more about the distilled wisdom and expectation, and sometimes just whim of the person you work for. So it's become increasingly important. And certainly when we look at it from a math standpoint, intent to stay, desire to lead, productivity, efficiency, satisfaction in the workplace, quality, and then what we call extra role behavior, which is basically just going above and beyond at work. All those things massively positively correlated, right, with the employee's relationship with the boss, which leads to this sense of satisfaction, which then immediately translates, particularly for customer-facing employees, into better outcomes on things like the customer experience. So the short version of this, without all the math, is it matters a lot, and it's increasing in how much it matters.
Thank you, Bill. And one of the other things that I would also say is it has become even more important in the pandemic. The research data is not there yet, because obviously we've all only been basically gathering it up and sort of digesting it. But you've already heard today from the previous speakers how very individualistic the experiences of people in the pandemic have been. A lot of it has been obviously driven by their circumstances, whether they, are alone at home, or they have children, or whether they can or cannot work remotely, and all those kinds of things. But one of the things that has certainly also had a big differentiating impact is the degree to which their boss has been able to tailor the work to the situation, has been able to take them through this very tough, challenging, almost shocking time, both in their lives and in their work. And I'll just share with you one example, which I thought was really, really interesting. Looking at women working at home or remotely who have children, and then comparing here in the graph, the black is people whose bosses had set out a decent but not great workflow and schedule, and didn't provide a lot of flexibility for the individual. And the blue bars are the people who had a very clear set of expectations and a very clear workflow and scheduling system, and a lot of flexibility for them to themselves take agency over when and how to do the work, as long as they were delivering to the sort of agreed guidelines. And you can see the enormous difference in how productive these people felt that they were. So 4 times more productive if they had this kind of good practical support from their working environment, almost twice as engaged, and 3 times as likely to say that they were experiencing positive well-being. And so all of these things, again, not just are important for that person themselves, are more likely to make them stay at your particular company, but also make that company more successful in the long run. Now, it's great for us to say this, we wish we had all better bosses. I personally think that there are 3 billion people in the world who work for some kind of a boss, and we could enormously raise those people's overall well-being levels if their bosses were all just a little bit better. But it is actually really hard to be a good boss. I'm sure each of us has our own experiences of both working for bosses who maybe were not that brilliant, but also ourselves struggling or finding ways to try and become better. There's some research out there which says that only about 10% of people kind of inherently have this emotional and social and other sort of capabilities required of a good boss. And there are lots of different frameworks for what a really good boss looks like. But my personal kind of simple way of putting it is somebody who's able to build trust with their team members. And that requires both, obviously, some technical competency, but it definitely also requires a lack of self-focus. So, not being so focused on yourself and more focused on your team members. Now, some of these things are possible to learn. Some of them are harder to learn. What we've done in our research is try to distill through all of the research that exists out there a couple of really practical things every single person can do, regardless of their kind of starting point. And here are our kind of 4 prescriptions for every single boss, which are, first of all, be kind. Just have empathy. Think about the other person and put yourself in their shoes. Understand that they might be going through some stuff. Ask them how they're doing and genuinely care about what the answer is. Everybody can do that. That's not difficult. Secondly, be thankful. Thank people for what they've done, even if it's a small thing. Yes, it might be that it's their job to do it, but it doesn't cost you anything to thank people. It's completely, in fact, it makes you feel better when you thank them. So it's a win-win. You feel better, they feel better, and they are encouraged to do a better job in the future. Thirdly, be positive. Frame things in a positive way, but obviously realistic. And celebrate really even small wins. There's a lot of research now that shows that, yes, having big goals and visions is important, but so is just celebrating every single day the little progress that is made, so that people feel that they're not stuck, they're not so far away from the goal that they're never going to reach it. And then finally, a good boss needs to look after themselves. If you yourself are super stressed out, anxious or even depressed, it's very hard for you to be empathetic. It's very hard for you to remember to thank people. It's very hard for you to frame things in a positive way. And so it's really important that bosses, look after their own health and well-being as well, and then they can be better bosses and everybody is better off. Now, these are things that anybody can do, even if the organization around them is not super clued into this idea of better bosses. We hope that they were, but sometimes you're in a situation where this is not that valued in your organization. You can still do these things. Of course, ideally, organizations really support everybody in their management cadre to do these things and more. And so, Bill, I wanted to ask you what you think businesses can do, organizations can do, especially when it comes to training and other kinds of support mechanisms to make sure that their bosses do have these kinds of competencies and skills.
I mean, one quick thing there, back where you were talking about, we've had a question come in around during the pandemic, and the previous one around where it was organized and disorganized and inflexible versus organized and flexible. The one thing that's really interesting there is after 15 months of being kind of holed up, what would have been initially viewed as discretionary, and people were thankful for receiving it because it was unusual, has now become an expectation. So you were describing in the motivation stuff, what's hygiene versus what's motivating. In the earliest parts of the pandemic, it was incredibly motivating because someone was looking out after me and going against the norm. Well, the norm then was when we went to work every day. Now, after 15 months, it has swung decidedly to the expectation is we will be flexible. We will take into account the stacking of my role at work and the role at home. So I think it's interesting, even the nature of the exchange in the relationship has changed after 15 months. I've spent more time in the last 4 weeks on companies thinking about the return and how to communicate something where at least one leader was in a world, well, of course, they're all just coming back. It's like, dude, 15 months. You've lost that card. That's out. And if you try to instill that now, you are going to see a mass exodus. So one, I think for the leaders, and I love the 4 basic things. And by the way, when you look at what we've listed here about being thoughtful, being kind, being positive, taking care of yourself, if it seems like Captain Obvious walked into the room, it's because it is obvious. So think about all the other stuff that must be going on in the boss's head to make that no longer be obvious. How could you explain why an otherwise well-intended person wouldn't be doing it? Well, they're dealing with their own stuff. They're dealing with their own pressures, their own things. And in many cases, what Tera was getting at, we've likely promoted them for technical or functional talent, and we've likely massively underinvested in their development as leaders. We may have invested in their development as a manager, and I'm using those words quite specifically, where we made them a bit of a bureaucrat about managing workflow. The vast majority of them have not actually received really, really good sponsorship, really, really good actual mentorship, real investment in what it looks like to take care of the human, with the assumption then that the human will take care of the customer or the work. So some of this is just, you reap what you sow, right? And we had a question there, do you think it's going to change? I think the extent to which people really wrap their head around what work needs to be done, who needs to do the work, whether or not they need to do it together, and where they're going to do it. So in our language, work, workforce, workplace. The extent to which that really becomes embedded, the skills towards the bottom of this page become dramatically more important. So you start taking technical and functional skills as a given. You shouldn't be picking the person if they can't do the job. But once you pick that, you'll invest in things like, how do you sponsor remotely? How do you be thoughtful about understanding that you can't possibly know it all? And you can't possibly put yourself in that person's position, but you can listen and see them, right? How can you be aware and attuned to what's going on? I mean, for me personally, I love it in Zooms where you got to see everybody's kids. You acknowledge that you were going to see how interested their cats were in personal grooming, right? That happened in like all those calls. And for me, I think it humanized everyone in a way that said, well, maybe rather than just seeing that person as a vessel to get work done, you could see them as the person first. So in the OHI, what we call Organizational Health Index, the big measure that we use to say how well is the company being run, a couple practices directly related to how a leader showed up this way, consultative leadership, supportive leadership, leading with and motivating through inspirational values. Those have all massively picked up in terms of their relationship to overall health. The message in plain language is the better leaders even mattered more, right, during this period of time because there was so much anxiety and so much uncertainty. So I guess the takeaway here is we're not training them to do it. We're not picking them to do it. And if you keep going in that direction, you're going to have people walking out the door.
I think that's a really good message to end our presentation on. We've got some time for questions and answers, and Bill has already been able to have a look at the Q&A and has answered some of them. But Kevin, I'll throw it back to you in case you wanted to bring us back to some of the thoughts that we've already shared, or any particular burning questions that the audience has.
Thank you, Tera and Bill. That was great. People sometimes say that managers today need to be part therapist, but I think a lot of it is pretty simple, as you highlighted, just saying thank you, asking how people are doing. There was a survey last fall that showed that about 70% of workers said no one said thank you in the workforce. No one had appreciated them recently. So there's some pretty simple things, as you say. We have one question, which Bill, you started to address. I want to just sort of underscore it, which is we've had traditional thoughts about who makes a good manager, what their attributes are. Last week, I was speaking with Ashok Krish of Tata Consultancy Services, and he was saying that during the pandemic, they found that introverts were actually better managers for remote work than extroverts who were great if they're walking around a workplace, but they found themselves at a loss outside of the physical context of a workplace. And so we have a similar question from Heidi Basarab, which is basically like, how should companies be rethinking who is actually being promoted into management roles? And it's, are they people who are good with people as opposed to people who just excel at individual contributor roles? What would you recommend there?
Well, for sure, it's expanded. The sphere of expectations should have expanded, right? If you think about classic knowledge, skills, attributes, experiences, you do need to know what you're doing, right? Like it is a given. You still actually need to know, can you do the job, right? Background, right credentialing. I think the attributes part is one that should come more into the fore. And, many folks have shied, or there's been an ebb and a flow into how they think about psychometrics and that sort of testing. But there is something, you mentioned it, around being an introvert. The extent to which your personality makes you more or less predisposed to thrive in a certain environment. Now, introverts, if you think about it, I've heard someone say that, this has been wonderful for introverts who didn't really like the office environment anyway. Yes, if a lot of their work was as an individual contributor and there was a little bit of a putting it over the parapet, then that's fine. But if you actually do still need to collaborate, it requires more facilitative skills, more thoughtful interactions to make sure it remains inclusive. So I think the job's gotten a little harder. Probably do need to be a little bit more nuanced. And I would say the one thing for sure is that the idea that the leader can opt out and isn't responsible for the emotional contagion they put in is just nonsense. They are responsible for the environment they create for the workers, period, right? Or you don't get to lead. That part, I think, if someone was saying about the thank you, I promise this is 30 seconds. Most people in Western Europe and North America who are currently in management roles were raised in an environment where we were told about balancing positives with negatives, right? I mean, and all the way back to Dr. Spock about managing it. But if you think about our actual existence, it is primarily deficit-based. Don't touch that. Come back here. Don't go there. Walk away. Leave your sister alone. Avoid this. That's scary. I mean, if you think about the amount of parenting you got that was redirection, cautionary, or safety-oriented, it is largely fear-based. Fear of something bad happening. So what we should be surprised, when people go to work and they don't acknowledge the little positive things, but they're always looking for the thing that could be better, or a thing that might go wrong. We've been grown this way. It is unnatural to acknowledge small things. The people who do it naturally are so wonderful. The people who say, hey, I practice gratitude, they're like a breath of fresh air, but it often seems a little foreign. Think about the number of people you've met who thank you for small things. You think, well, what are they getting on about? What's that? Right?
Yeah.
Do you find that in flashback?
I want to build on that, Bill, because there's a fine balance between being authentic. You have to be authentic. If you're thanking people, you shouldn't just be doing it because you think that's what you're supposed to be doing. But equally, there's an element of fake it till you make it. And my personal experience has been, as an extreme introvert, been brought up by exactly that kind of parents, where it's all about what you got wrong and how to fix it. It's been a journey to discover that actually by being more human at work and recognizing these more emotional aspects of other human beings it can be done in a way that initially feels a little bit forced, but you get immediate positive feedback. You get reinforcing feedback from your team members. You see that they're happy. You see that they're excited. You see that they're doing better. It doesn't take many times before it starts to then become a habit, because you're like, okay, I wish I'd known this earlier, but now I do know it and it really works. It works for me and it works for them. And I think, I generally speaking don't like kind of putting people into boxes and saying, well, this person an introvert or an extrovert or will do better here or whatever, because all humans have an enormous capacity to learn. But, the kind of thing you have to unlearn first is the sort of thing that Bill was talking about, and recognizing that there are different ways, different mental models than the ones that you might have learned either at school or from your parents or even at your MBA. So I don't think everybody does need to be a therapist, but you just need to unlearn some of the slightly less helpful behaviors.
Jenny Anderson is noting in the chat that John Gottman recommends in marriage is 6 positive for every negative. So probably some bosses could shift to that ratio.
Or you look, well, if the divorce rate paralleled the washout rate of managers, maybe we'd be better off.
Yeah, you could probably graph those across each other. We have a question from David Wallace, and then I want to ask you one last question before we close. David Wallace from Boston, and I think he's referring, Bill, to what you're talking about, the macro context, where he asked, do you count decline in union or related workplace support in the importance of the shift to the importance of managers as well?
For sure. Yeah, I saw that one earlier when it came up. I think it's really interesting because I think that trend is about to change, I might add. So if you think about the petri dish of why representation, and particularly through collective bargaining units, went down, they were at an all-time low, right? And more recently, really, really low. I think we're seeing the trend coming back on multiple fronts. One, just the sense of workers wanting to feel like the work that they're doing has more purpose. You know, a lot of the safety stuff had gotten handled reasonably well, not perfect, but reasonably well. And I think people, by and large, the relative wages are going up. The stagnation in wages, the wage gap, disparity in the wage, and in particular, as some of the larger companies have gone off in a field in what they've done, like what they're doing with data, what they're doing with others, I think you're seeing organizations, particularly employees, saying, we have agency, we have voice, and we're going to take it back. It is actually not just about money. So, you know, if you look at professional sports, the CBA in professional sports is everything but money. It's work rules, it's influence, it's shared, it's shared governance. I think we're going to see way more of that. I think the start in the tech in the West Coast is just a harbinger, and I think we'll see a rise of representation again. And for the, let's say, less skilled workforce, a return to guilds. All the concern around upskilling and reskilling, you can either have the companies do it or you can have the unions do it. And you have a much higher standardization of credentialing and licensing. I think we go that way. And by no means, by the way, am I saying, gee, that went swimmingly well the first time we did it. I just think we're going to see a rise of it. That's all.
That's really interesting. And this moment of return to workplace could be a moment that catalyzes some of that. I want to ask you one last question before we move on. Tera, I'm going to start with you. If you could advise managers to do or not do one thing, based on your research about what makes a better boss, what would that one thing be?
I think it would be, I don't know, there's so many, but I'm just going to say kind of focus on building trust. Because I think when you start thinking about that word trust and what goes into it, it kind of has underneath all of the qualities that you'd want in your workplace. And both the things that make it easier for the individual and make their lives better, but also for you as a manager and you as a company to perform better. So I think it's a kind of a golden nugget if you can build trust.
It's foundational. Bill, what would be your one?
I'd have one thing. You've spent 15 months building a goodwill reservoir. Don't waste it by a foolish desire to return to what was.
Mm-hmm. Great. So don't push people back into their death.
Listen, it doesn't mean people shouldn't come back to the office. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying thinking that we're magically going back to 5 days a week, sitting in traffic, up to 2 hours a day, to shoot yourself while you're sitting on the highway. Why would you do that? You don't need to do it. You've just had an experience of it working. Acknowledge that, because otherwise it becomes spurious to you. You want it because you want to see people at the coffee machine. You have 15 months of goodwill.
Yeah.
Use it, Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, we're going to end there. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Tera. This was great.